Hi everyone, my name is Will Florsheim, and my lesson is about, and my research for this course has been about Korean comfort women in the employ of the Japanese military in World War II. So within my lesson plan, there's three learning goals that there will exist for students. You can see those on the top. The first one kind of is just a basic understanding of the comfort woman system. For many kids, this is brand new information to them that the Japanese recruited these women many times, or the Koreans kind of in the employ of the Japanese recruited these women, how they were treated in the war, what conditions they had, and then basically the legacy of the war afterwards. Also, students will need to evaluate primary source documents and be able to analyze and interpret various arguments made and the implications of those documents for their understanding of the comfort women system today. And also, lastly, students will need to be able to use their interpretations gained from the primary sources to make their own argument on a contemporary issue surrounding comfort women and their treatment still today. So every day in my classroom, students start with an anticipatory set. I call it my day starter activity. So kids are used to coming into class and writing down something that's on the board in front of them. And so today for this lesson, it would be they're going to read a portion of their textbook actually that talks about comfort women, and they're going to use the analysis or the perspective narrative advanced in their textbook to analyze maybe what is included but also what isn't included, and how that narrative from the textbook would be received by people on both sides of the debate over comfort women and how they should be seen today. So my students would have access to their own textbooks where they would have this passage, but for your benefit in this class, I typed the section basically from their textbook. It's only two short paragraphs that explains comfort women. For your benefit, and also I would share with my students, this has been a highly controversial passage that was included by McGraw-Hill in this textbook that I use in my course, Traditions and Encounters. It's a very popular text used in AP courses across the country, but it's definitely received a lot of condemnation by the Japanese government in particular for what they perceive to be inaccuracies in the account. And my hope would be that my students would pick some of that out without me telling them that in advance, and I would only share that afterwards. After the initial day starter activity, to give some context to students about the comfort women issue, I have a series of note slides that I would provide for students, just to give some background and context, as I said. So to start off with, some things I'd want students to understand, to really understand why comfort women were ever used in the first place. First would be Japanese ideology, and places that Japanese views kind of differed from American ideology, especially at the time of World War II. First of all, looking at, comfort women were used for sexual relations for Japanese service personnel. So just the view of sex and the idea that in Japanese culture, self-gratification was far more acceptable. They were far more comfortable with it, physical pleasures, than we are still today in American culture, and certainly were at that time. The other thing is just kind of the view of a Japanese soldier and the Japanese fighting spirit. The greatest value for the Japanese, this information on the bottom of the slide, was the strength of will, and that great virtue. In Japanese, it's referred to as on, and the virtue also of chu, but just in your lifetime, to basically to fulfill what you were responsible to others, and especially chu, the fealty, kind of like in the Confucian tradition, what was owed to the emperor became more important than anything in World War II. So to tie it all together, basically the comfort woman system and using women for sex was seen as acceptable because it allowed the soldiers and also the women to revere the emperor the way they needed to. I would also want my students to understand kind of some Amerocentric or views that we have that would be certainly would lead us to be biased in looking at the comfort women issue. First of all, again, how Americans are more moralistic when it comes to sexual relations than the Japanese were. Also, conduct in war, we tend to believe as Americans that we're far more upstanding than other people. oftentimes because we've been victors in wars, but that doesn't mean that our conduct has always been truly upstanding. American servicemen, as you'll see later in this presentation, also used comfort women, and that happened in the European theater as well as it did in the Pacific. And lastly, we tend to believe that the Japanese, how we have a hard time understanding how they treated Korean women the way they did, but we have to remember that Korea was a colony of Japan at the time, and when we consider the American record on treating colonial peoples, it hasn't always been very good. Lastly, I would also want to review information with students about some events in China that influenced the Japanese development of the comfort woman system. First of all, in Shanghai in 1932, the Japanese, after a successful defeat of the Chinese in a battle near Shanghai, ended up leaving their troops in Shanghai, in which a number of Japanese army personnel went through Shanghai and raped a number of women, which initially led to calls for comfort stations because it was ending in chaos, and the commanders there understood begrudgingly that they needed to do something differently. Then the rape of Nanking, rape of Nanjing in 1937, with as many as 80,000 Chinese women potentially raped in the streets, and just the conflict that debate continues to have in relations between Japan and China today about which facts or which numbers really to accept as historical accuracy. So you see pictures here of some of the women from Nanjing, and it was really after this horrific event in Nanjing that the Japanese decided that they needed something like a comfort women or a comfort station system to prevent Japanese soldiers from engaging in this kind of action throughout the conduct of the Second World War. Next, I would provide some basic background for my students on the comfort women system. Beginning with the recruitment of comfort women, which is one of the most hotly debated topics by the Japanese and the Koreans still today, whether these women were sex slaves or whether they willfully volunteered themselves for prostitution and chances of better livelihoods and better living conditions by working as comfort women during the war. So you can see on this slide there's really three different ways historians have found that potentially women ended up as comfort women, ranging from either they volunteered for it as prostitutes, something they maybe had already been doing for an occupation. You see many accounts of Korean women that talked about how they were basically tricked into working for the Japanese. And then the last one was you also see accounts of where women just flat out say that they were nothing short of abducted and taken into sexual slavery for the Japanese. So you see here an example of a comfort station that was in Shanghai. These comfort stations basically extended anywhere the Japanese Empire did, and the women tended to follow the Japanese army, Imperial Army, as it expanded. So you found these comfort stations anywhere from China to Burma to the Philippines and beyond. So working conditions in the comfort stations, basically women would report very few breaks, working and seeing as many as 30 to 40 to 50 men a day at times, coerced interactions, not having choice, oftentimes having men standing in line, many of them coming into the rooms while they were finishing up with one soldier, half clothed, they're unclothed, ready to take their turn in line. Many accounts of drunken violence, that women had some ability to, if they were able to fend off a drunken soldier, to stand up for themselves, but ultimately not a lot. And there was many records of violence and brutality, many women abused, in addition to serving in their roles as prostitutes or sex slaves. And ultimately, the last thing that I would want to share with students is towards the end of the war, when the war ended for everybody else, the comfort women, the war didn't really end for them, because the Japanese tended to believe that American GIs would come into Japan. They had this negative view of Americans, that they would come into Japan and basically go through and rape, average civilian Japanese women if there wasn't some kind of a comfort station or comfort women system available. So the Japanese went out of their way to create comfort women systems, which they called recreation centers for U.S. GIs. And as you see on the screen here, we estimate that as many as 50,000 Japanese prostitutes actually ended up serving U.S. GIs after the war was already over during the occupation period. And that's kind of what you see in this picture here, an American GI with a Japanese comfort girl. So the major portion of my lesson that students will take part in is I have some primary sources prepared from different perspectives, whether it's the official Japanese statement made in the 1990s about the comfort woman system, or it's actually voices of some of the comfort women that served the Japanese army. Students are going to have a chance to read the primary sources, fill out what's called an identity chart to try to help them understand the person who's featured in the source. And then they're going to have a small conversation as if it was taking place in a coffee shop or a cafe, where they try to come to terms with other people with different perspectives on this comfort woman system, and then use that information they get in those conversations to help them craft a larger understanding of some of the diverse perspectives regarding the whole system. So the participants in this cafe conversations, there's 5 different perspectives. You see 3 of them were comfort women. One of them comes from the U.S. Office of War Information. It came from POW interviews that took place late in the war. And then the last one is from Yohei Kono, who was the voice of the Japanese government as a government minister at the time, or cabinet secretary, basically that made a statement in 1993 about where the Japanese government stands on the comfort woman system. So here's an example of one of the primary sources. This was from one of the comfort women here that students will receive. They're each about 1 page worth of reading that comes from a text or an account that I pulled from somewhere else. Here's an example of the identity chart with some questions that students will fill out as they read their source, and it's really just questions that are meant to make them think a little bit about bias and how other people might respond to, or other sources might respond to the perspective that's shared in the source they've read. And then lastly, as students have their cafe conversations and they listen to the 4 other perspectives than their own, or the other interpretations, they'll record some information and try to think about the context for why people thought as they did about the comfort woman system. So the last portion of my lesson actually includes a modern day event and the debate continuing to rage on today between Korea and Japan, and then other actors around the world that have gotten involved. This video clip, as well as an article that students will read from recently in the Washington Post, discusses, as you can see on the screen, a comfort women statue that has been placed in San Francisco that is really upset the Japanese, including getting the mayor of Osaka to basically drop a sister city designation that they have. And so students are going to watch this video, read the article, and then the final thing they're going to do in this lesson is a writing assignment in which they write a letter to the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, the biggest paper in San Francisco, in which they consider different interpretations of the comfort women over time, and then they use those interpretations basically to say which perspectives have won out in their own mind, and then give some advice to the city of San Francisco using this assignment form as what students will receive in class. And they'll basically do a 1-page writing in their letter to the editor in which they explain what should the city of San Francisco do and which interpretations should win out. Were the Korean women basically taken as sex slaves? Or is the Japanese government, does the historical record kind of prove instead that many of these women were prostitutes and they entered into the system, and history's been a little bit unfair to the Japanese and how they've been treated in looking at comfort women over time. So students are going to analyze all those perspectives they gained in this lesson, and as a summative assessment, have an opportunity to write this 1-page letter to the editor and also give some advice to the city of San Francisco about what to do with this statue that's caused conflict. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.